Thank you all for joining us for our roundtable on the history of immigration in Florida. Thank you to the sponsors of this event, especially those that form part of the Forward Together Florida Coalition. Throughout this discussion, there will also be interpretation features available, and the interpreters now will explain exactly how to use that function.
Thank you, Marian. Gracias. Buenas tardes, mi nombre es María Angélica, mis pronombres son ella y ellex, y hoy mi colega Flavia y yo estamos proveyendo interpretación en español y en inglés con MARP Language Services para asegurarnos de que todos tengamos acceso a esta importante información que están compartiendo hoy, al igual que nos expresemos en el idioma que prefiramos. Este es un reflejo de nuestra comunidad que es multilingüe, multicultural y que el idioma forma un puente entre diferentes comunidades. Vamos a proveer la interpretación por medio de Zoom. Entonces, si ustedes quieren escuchar la conversación en español y nos están acompañando desde su computador en Zoom, en la parte de abajo a la derecha hay un globo que dice interpretación. Cuando ustedes le hacen clic a ese globo, pueden elegir español si quieren escuchar en español, inglés si quieren escuchar inglés, o si hablan los dos idiomas, pueden mantener su interpretación apagada. Si nos están acompañando desde su teléfono, disculpe, si están conectados a Zoom desde su teléfono, en la parte de abajo de su pantalla hay 3 puntos. Cuando ustedes tocan los 3 puntos, eligen interpretación de idiomas, escogen el idioma que prefieran y después presionan hecho. Ahora, si ustedes están acompañándonos desde Facebook Live en este momento, pueden llamar al número telefónico 305-707-5958. La interpretación en el teléfono estará disponible solamente durante el tiempo que el Facebook Live esté en vivo. Muchas gracias. Good afternoon. My name is María Angélica. My pronouns are she and they. And today I will be providing interpretation in Spanish and in English alongside my colleague Flavia with MARP Language Services to ensure that we all have access to this important information in the language that we prefer between Spanish and English, as well as to express ourselves in the language that we choose. This is a reflection of our community, which is multilingual, multicultural, and the fact that language serves as a bridge to create unity in communities. If you want to access interpretation today and you're joining us in Zoom from your computer, at the bottom right-hand corner, you will see a globe that says interpretation. When you click on the globe, you can choose Spanish if you want to listen in Spanish, English if you want to listen in English, or if you speak both languages and you want to hear the original audio, you can choose to have your interpretation off. If you're joining us in Zoom from your phone, at the bottom right-hand corner of your phone screen, there is 3 dots. When you touch the dots, you can choose language interpretation and choose the language that you prefer, and then you touch done. That is all. I am dropping the instructions in the chat. And if you're joining us today through Facebook Live, you can call the interpretation live in order to listen to this section in Spanish by calling the number. One second. I lost it. I apologize, 1 second. Yes, 305-707-5958. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for providing those explanations on the interpretation and as well as providing your interpretation services throughout this exposition and this event. In addition, if anybody in the audience has any questions or comments that they would like to include, feel free to do so using the chat or Q&A function. There's also a Google form, which I've included in the chat just now, where you can include your feedback, questions, as well as and to express whether you want to continue staying part in this exposition's work in the future. My name is Marianne Quijano. I'm a PhD student at the University of Florida, studying Latin American and Caribbean history. And it's my pleasure to chair and moderate this panel on the history of immigration. Right now, I'll begin by briefly introducing the topics of this discussion, which happens to be the history of immigration in the state of Florida, and the many ways that historians have tackled and are starting to tackle how to study this state. So it's important to realize that we often think of Florida as a single state within the United States. But if we even just look at it at a map, it remains connected to the Caribbean Sea and to the larger Atlantic Ocean. So Florida actually remains part of larger networks of traveling ideas, peoples, and cultures that can easily flow over borders if we think about it. And studying Florida's history shows us that multiple worlds and multiple nations have existed within the state since its very early origins, with those nations moving in and out of the country or out of the state through migration over time. So migration in Florida's history can generally occur with Florida serving as a refuge for people seeking safety or opportunity or a new home, or it can serve also as a site of displacement, with Florida sometimes acting as a site of detention and eventual deportation. As early as the 1500s, historians recently have looked at how Florida's Black and Indigenous history shows that movement has always been a part of its history. It hasn't always been criminalized the same way that we see it has been today. Indigenous people in the Caribbean often traveled to and from Florida while also traveling to the Bahamas, to Cuba, and to Spain. Florida's Black history also shows how integral migration has been to Florida's existence. Enslaved Africans in the Caribbean often fled to Florida when it was once a Spanish colony in search of better treatment and freedom in the face of brutal treatment from enslavers and from colonial empires. Yet when Florida became a part of the United States in its more familiar form that we know of today, we started to see a criminalization of migration, and migration used more as punishment. Beginning in the 1810s, for instance, Florida's indigenous communities saw forced movement out of their lands. They migrated not out of their own voluntary will, but out of displacement once their lands were seized by European Americans. In the early 1900s, nearly 100 years later, we see also thousands of African Americans choosing to flee from Florida and from the South in large migrations in search often of better economic survival and better safety conditions in the height of racial violence. So the last 100 years from then, from about the 1900s until now, we see that migration continues to dominate our discussions when we talk about Florida's present and its future. And we see in news channels and also among government officials this tendency to portray immigrants as dangerous and criminal, as though it's always been criminal. In particular, the fear of Blackness and a fear of Black migrants coming to Florida has provoked an array of responses across the US, from lawmakers reinterpreting who and what a legitimate refugee could be, and Americans gathering in angry masses, sometimes in total disdain for the presence of immigrants in cities like Miami. So instead of treating immigrants' histories and life stories as totally separate, as a totally different history from Florida's larger histories, historians are actually uniting those histories. The work of researchers, like the ones included in this panel, teaches us that while Floridians debate over whether Florida should go down in history as a refuge for migrants or as a tough border against migration, immigrants have already been shaping Florida's history and are still shaping it throughout just their daily lives. Looking at this history reminds us that searching for refuge, opportunity, and personal ties are the same things that continue to bring migrants to Florida, just like they almost did 500 years ago. Florida's immigrants in the last 100 years have created new worlds and communities through Florida's neighborhoods, their schools, their labor industries, and their cultural scenes. Part of Florida's history then is how immigrants redefine for themselves what being Black can mean, what being a worker can mean in the modern world, what their homeland can mean for them, and also what Florida means. And so with that, let me introduce the discussants in our panel who will be discussing each of these immigrant histories at a greater length. First, we have Alexandra Sinatis. She's the Assistant Director for Programming and Public Engagement at the University of Florida. She earned her MA and her BA at the University of Florida, her MA in Latin American Studies and her BA in Political Science. Her research looks at the connections between gender, religion, race, and Haiti. And her research has also had the pleasure of being funded by the UF Duke National Endowment for the Humanities to explore in particular the role of priestesses in Haitian voodoo. She most recently looked at Haiti's social and economic transformations that shaped Haitian voodoo's priestesses' lives. In collaboration with other scholars at the University of Florida, she published an online exhibition that looks at the histories of Haitian immigrants in the United States. The Haitian American Dream, it's a digital humanities project funded by the UF Mellon's Intersections Group. I think that Alexandra already included the link there if you're interested in looking at it in a later time. Our next discussant is Heather Gonyu, a PhD candidate at the University of Florida. Heather is a PhD candidate in particular specializing in Latin American history. Her dissertation, which she's working on now, looks at health among migrants in Miami from Cuba and their role in the medicine and healthcare industry in South Florida throughout the last 100 years in the 20th century. She's originally from Massachusetts with BAs in history and Latin American studies from George Mason University. And she also received her MA in history from UF in 2008 by studying the role of sports and fitness in Cuba's healthcare revolution in the 20th century. And she continues to investigate questions about public health and fitness among Latin Americans throughout the globe. And then our third candidate is Terrell Orr. He's a PhD candidate at the University of Georgia, studying the US South from a global perspective. And he's interested in how capitalist transformations in agriculture from the emancipation to the Korean Revolution have divided and united farm workers in the US South, the Caribbean, Latin America. He's currently looking at labor and capital in Florida and Sao Paulo, Brazil's intertwined citrus industries that have been funded very generously and with an affiliation at the Universidad Estadual de Campinas. And he's been published in the journal Southern Cultures and has presented at numerous conferences in the past. Panelists will spend time introducing their approach to the study of immigrant communities and nations in Florida and how Florida fits within the international field of work that they are a part of. After that, we can have follow-up questions, responses, and comments from the audience. So why don't you start off for us, Alexandra, first?
Sure. Thank you so much, Marianne, for this wonderful introduction. So it's a pleasure for me to be here to pretty much talk about the work that I did in collaboration with Dr. Margarita Vargas and also Ivana Moreno. So I would say one thing I always liked to do is pretty much provide, because I'm not a historian, but I always because I feel like when someone is studying Haiti, you always have to go back to history to understand literally the present and the future. So I will start by providing some really key important information about the past so we can understand why, for instance, a lot of Haitian immigrants ended up being in Florida, and from being in Florida, the different ways that the state responded to those particular immigrant and also some of its citizens, how they responded to them, and also how the legacies of those particular immigration policies or actions, federal actions, state actions, pretty much contributed to how Asian interact with the states, right? Even as of right now in the context of a pandemic. So in terms of understanding, I would say, Haiti's relationship with the US. Haiti's relationship with the US, I will say, starts with the, let's say, the Haitian Revolution. So with the Haitian Revolution, the US does not recognize Haiti. because obviously the Haitian Revolution itself challenged the concept that you have that slave are not property. They need to be treated as human being, right? So, and it's also that's something that Michel Roth-Trio was a very known anthropologist, mentioned that it was literally unexpected. And because it was unexpected, there is this particular erasure that happened where we will not recognize that particular state. But even though this happened, there's always movement that actually occurred, where, for instance, the slave owners started migrated during the revolution process or after the Haitian Revolution. They migrated to New Orleans specifically. And especially if you were a slave, if you were white passing per se, sometimes you were able to be in New Orleans, or if you're a slave owners, you were able to live in New Orleans. So you also have that particular aspect. And then from there, you tend to have, I would say, with the Cold War, a shift that actually occurred with the relationship that existed between Haiti and the US. So, for instance, with the Cold War, the United States pretty much began his fight against communism. And that's one of the reasons why the United States pretty much started invading different countries within Latin America, along them Haiti. So you have in the 1950s, the US occupation. So a lot of people sometimes don't know that the US occupied Haiti for, I believe, like at least like 30 years. And around that particular time, you also see, even with when you're looking into the historical archive, that they tend to frame Haiti as this touristic place, right? So US citizens who are tired, exhausted from work will come to the Caribbean and get some relaxation. Then you will see, you also will be interacting with the Caribbean. So you definitely tend to see that particular area, like Caribbean itself, being kind of like this exotic place where you can go spend some temporary time, enjoy yourself, where you can actually consume the Caribbean per se. And then after the occupation, you tend to see that a lot of like Haitian president tends to pretty much side becomes kind of like the allies of the United States. So because if you are not an ally, then that means you're pretty much going to get reversed from the government, right? So that's pretty much one of the things that you tend to see. And this is how me providing this particular key factor makes people understand what happened with the rise of Duvalier, because Duvalier understand those particular geodynamics. And because he understood those particular geodynamics, then he pretty much was, I would say, playing the game. So I will give you what you want, so you can also give me some what I want. And that's pretty much why all the torture massacre that Duvalier did, the United States pretty much turned a blind eye on it. So it happens, they will deny it. They will say, oh, that's not pretty much what happened, and stuff like that. And you also see as Duvalier began to be in power, he also started installing his own army, which is called the Totomakut. So by having those particular Totomakut, so you pretty much have your neighbors policing you. So if you don't align or you don't support Duvalier, they can legitimately decide to kill you. And you also see a lot of like reports where people will say, my wife or my husband, my father, my friends went to work, we didn't see them again, and they just disappeared. So you start seeing those particular patterns where people will be reporting as well, reporting them. So this is where you start seeing the rise of the wave of Haitian migration in the US. It also happened in other countries. So you also see a lot of like Haitian migrating to Congo, for instance, because at that time, Congo was newly elected, newly independent. So they needed a workforce. So you also see a lot of doctors, engineer, probably like the Haitian elite moving to those particular space. So France, moving to Congo, and you start seeing them coming to the United States, specifically in New York and then Boston. Then with also the rise of neoliberalization that also occurred, where we wanted to, a lot of US companies wanted to establish, I would say, factories in Haiti. So because they wanted to establish a lot of factories in Haiti, and then also you see they start, the Duvalier government start, I would say, providing them, not only policies, but also things where they start seizing land, I would say seizing lands and stuff. And you also see one of the ways it is manifested is the killing of Haitian pigs. So you have, there is a surplus of food, well, in terms of like the pig industry. So they pretty much, and when the swine flu actually occurred, they forced the Haitian government, well, the Haitian government in combination with the elite and all the stuff, decided to kill all the Haitian pig, which used to be like the saving account of the, I would say, of the Haitian peasant. So because of it, without any saving, because what used to happen when the peasant wanted to have money or cash money, liquid money, they will sell the pig and they will get it to pay their student tuition, to do things they needed for their families. So when it actually happened, obviously, this is where you start seeing the rise of Haitians coming to the US by boat. And obviously, when they start coming by boat, that's what the narrative start shaping, especially by the US media, where they start saying, oh my God, these are the boat people. Haiti, this is what's going on with Haiti. Haiti is a failed state. Those particular kind of situation. So this is pretty much where you start seeing the shift of how Haiti used to be a touristic place where people could come and enjoy themselves, where you also now seeing where we don't want Haitian immigrants, they are coming to our place, and stuff like that. So the way the state itself start reacting, it's very different than how they interact with, for instance, Cuban immigrants. So Cuban immigrants, because of Fidel Castro, and because of the fight of communism, so it was a way to say, when you come, you want to see the democracy, you want to do this. Not that I'm saying that Cuban immigrants didn't get any backlash, they did. However, in terms of the immigration policies or they were afforded, the same was not given to Haitian immigrants. So Haitian immigrants, we were not seen as political, like political refugees. We're more seen as economic refugees, even though there is documented effort that we had a dictator in power. So we're not seen as that. So because of this, there is this particular, backlash that happened in terms of how this state pretty much respond to Haitian immigrants. And one of the things that a lot of people don't know is the fact that and also during the rise of the HIV pandemic, because there's a lot of things that happened during that, Haitian were tied to be one of the groups that have HIV. So because of this, what does it mean? They were not allowed to work. You couldn't donate blood to your loved one. So for instance, if something happened, you were not able to actually give blood to your loved one. It took a lot of years for the CDC to remove Haitian immigrants, right, from that particular list. And no excuses were given to Haitian immigrants. But you also see the backlash because, for instance, we're seen as economic refugees. So a lot of Haitians, a lot of the boats were captured at sea and were returned back to Haiti. And also we in Guantanamo, you had a lot of Haitian immigrants when they tested positive, they pretty much had the first HIV camps in the US. So a lot of people don't even know we even have HIV camps in the US. So you also have all of this that is happening and all of those particular factors who pretty much shape Haitian migration in the US. So they always have been in limbo. So we are not afforded the same, I would say, immigration policies as others. So that's one of the things. And also there is also this framework that is always seen in terms Haiti is pretty much like a failed state. And you also have the language barrier because Haiti, you have French, which is sort of the legal language, official language, but you also have Haitian Creole. So a lot of the time, those particular services were not offered to Haitian immigrants. And also, of course, within the schools, we didn't have like Haitian professors who were trained. So there is a lot of the time, those particular negative effects that actually occurred that pretty much affect the way Asian immigrants interact with the state. And on top of that, so in that particular added layers, right, that we tend to have, you have now, for instance, with the pandemic, where, like I would say, history always continued to repeat itself. Where, for instance, now there is a campaign that are happening, like we need to get vaccinated and everything like that. But a lot of time, a lot of people forget that the interaction Haitian had with the CDC and how cautious they are of the CDC. So you also see this even with the history, those particular legacies continue to link on. So which means that we need to have an organic approach in terms of how we not only learn the history, but how we can learn from what happened in the past so we can make effective policies, not only in the present, but that can benefit us as a whole in the future. I will stop here. I don't know if you wanted me to go on in terms of time.
No, that's great. I think that was a great way to continue on to our next discussion, which will be given by Heather.
Great, thank you, Marianne. So I'm going to be talking about healthcare access within the immigrant community, particularly the Cuban American exiles. I kind of got into this topic in an interesting way. I was originally studying healthcare on the island of Cuba after the revolution, looking at how after a large portion of the island doctors left following the 1959 revolution, Castro's efforts to recruit and train an entire new generation of doctors with more of a revolutionary ideology and more of a eventually communist ideology as well. Then when the pandemic hit, most of my plans for my dissertation were sidelined, so I had to quickly reimagine my project. And this brought me to wondering, well, what happened to those physicians that did leave the island? So I started looking into Miami and the physicians that were exiles right after the Castro Revolution. And at first I was just looking to see, you know, how easily were they accepted into the medical field? And that really brought me into a much deeper exploration of healthcare and immigration than I originally thought. And I really learned that immigrants have a tremendous impact on the way that the healthcare landscape is actually formed in any community that they find themselves in. And it's really has become a rich field of study that I'm really excited to be a part of. So I'm interested in seeing how we can understand this relationship between healthcare and health access more broadly, both with immigrants in the American healthcare community, but then in the communities more broadly as well. So during this research, I found out that Latinx immigrants really overwhelmingly prefer to be seen by physicians or medical professionals of their own race or ethnicity. And that's actually been a really important statistic to my research because Hispanics make up about 20%, probably more, of the American population, but only 5% of doctors. And the reasons that were stated that Latinx peoples prefer to be seen by members of their own community are largely for language access reasons, that they feel like things are missed if they're not seen by healthcare professionals of their same ethnicity or language. But they also saw that they didn't feel like they were getting the respect that they deserved, that there were certain cultural connections that were missed, especially with the more elderly people in the community, felt that they really weren't being heard and understood and given appropriate time by the healthcare professionals that they saw. So this is extremely important, and one of the main purposes of my research is to explain why we need more diversity in healthcare. Because when we have people that understand broad cultures and more languages, that we can really provide better access for immigrant communities. So that's where I kind of got into the Cuban American community, and I'm going to explain my research with them a little more broadly. So there's this idea of Cuban exceptionalism in the field of history and Latin American history, which is saying that since a lot of the Cuban immigrants that came over in 1959 and later were largely wealthier, usually lighter skinned, and received a ton of aid from the American government, that they're really an exceptional group of immigrants in the American community. And part of my research is kind of dispelling that fact, that really in the end, the immigrants that came over from Cuba were much more diverse than we originally give them credit for, that they're diverse politically, that they're diverse culturally, and that they're much more ethnically diverse than we originally usually think of when we think of Cuban immigrants, especially in Miami. So this actually brought me, my research into 1959 actually brought me much farther back, because I'm trying to show that the need for healthcare that's accessible to your own culture and ethnicity is really a problem that all immigrants face, and not just the Cuban American immigrants that I study in my research. So that brought me to looking at sociedades mutualistas, which are like early insurance societies that were prominent throughout the Southwest with Mexican Americans. It brought me to certain ethnic cultural centers in Tampa, where Cuban Americans or other immigrant groups would create cultural clubs where they could have access to physicians that understood their needs, that they could have health insurance that would treat them at their clubs. Some of them even had clinics in the basements of their clubs where they could go to if they needed certain access to healthcare. And the funny thing is that usually these kind of mutual aid societies are focused on European immigrants, people like Germans, people like Eastern European immigrants in the Northeast. And the whole history of Hispanic societies that also focus on mutual aid has kind of been left behind. So that's really what I'm interested in showing, is that this is an immigrant problem that stretches throughout different ethnicities. And I actually really want to tie in my research into the Black hospital movement and the effort for Black physicians to be recognized in the early 19th and 20th century. And the way that when the Orthodox healthcare system shows minorities that they don't have a place, it's really up to the immigrants themselves to create a space, sometimes by force, to have their needs fit, either by creating those mutual clubs where they have their own clinics, where they know physicians are going to be attuned to their cultural needs, by creating their own hospitals or clinics where they can be seen, and finding a place for themselves within the larger healthcare community. So getting into the Cubans more specifically now, I'm really interested in this first wave of Cuban exiles who arrived in Miami. They had all of their Spanish language credentials. They had their credentials from the Cuban government, but they really didn't have a way to break into the American healthcare system. And they actually received a lot of racism from the other workers that they found themselves in the hospitals with. So they were working as orderlies, they were working as surgery technicians, they were working sometimes as nurses. Oh, sorry, I'll slow down. But they really weren't getting the same level of respect as their English speaking or American colleagues. So I have one instance that I found when I was going through the archives, which a higher level Cuban American doctor who had been established in the American healthcare system for a long time before the revolution and had quite a bit of respect, heard someone being called a racial slur while he was walking through the hallway. He immediately realized that this was one of the newly arrived Cuban American refugees, and that kind of propelled him almost immediately to start an entire organization dedicated to finding these exiles from the Havana Medical School and bringing them into the fold of the American medical community. So by the next day, they had gathered, I think, like dozens of the former colleagues at the University of Havana and created a kind of medical school in exile where they would hold classes to teach Cuban Americans how to get into the American healthcare system, how to pass their exams. They would have English classes so that they could understand the language that the exams were written in. They learned the obviously medical terminology that they were missing. And this created a huge difference. It was a program that just continued to grow and grow and grow. And eventually it actually included not just Cuban Americans, but people from other immigrant groups that the University of Miami also thought needed better access to break into the medical community. So then we have another big event that happens in 1981, where the Marielitos come over from Cuba. And this has become an interesting part because the Marielitos are often seen as a completely different class of refugees. So unlike the so-called golden refugees or the golden exiles, who were largely upper class or middle class, the professional class people say, the Marielitos are seen as, you know, a much lower class of refugees. They're called by their own government the gusanos. They're seen as, you know, delinquents and derelicts. But again, looking back historically, we see that a lot of that is a complete fabrication, that there were plenty of professionals that came over in the Marielitos, that they were very capable, and a lot of them also tried to integrate into the healthcare system as well, even, you know, forming triage centers in the refugee camps in order to help out the Cuban refugees that were already there. We also have those golden exiles who also came down and were really integral in getting the newly arrived Marielitos into hospitals. They would sometimes bring them in their own car from Key West up to Miami and put them into care in their own hospitals. So this is an interesting part with the Marielitos, that we kind of see an erasure of Afro-Cubans in our exploration of the Cuban American immigration phenomena. So Afro-Cubans came over in much larger numbers, or even just darker skinned Cubans came over in much larger numbers during the Marielito crisis. And at first, like I said, the Cuban American community and the American community more broadly really saw them as a whole different kind of class of refugee, and much different from their lighter skinned counterparts. And within just a few years, we really see that narrative erased completely. And when people are asked about the Marielitos, they say, oh, well, they were a problem, but now they've been integrated and it's totally fine. And we never really see them talked about as independent people again. So I think that's an interesting place that I would like to explore more, is what kind of racism did these Marielitos face when they tried to integrate into the healthcare system? Were they treated with similar racial slurs as their even lighter earlier counterparts? And, you know, did they have other ways that they wanted to access healthcare that we don't really see in the Orthodox system? So one of the things that I'm also looking at is, if you didn't go to a Cuban clinic, would you go to maybe a Santeria practitioner, and what those kind of non-Orthodox but more folk medicine traditions looked like, and how they've been able to survive. And that kind of brings me into conversation with some other immigrant groups like the Haitian immigrants, and how different immigrant groups in Miami have created spaces for non-traditional medicine. So I'm going to, I think, leave it at that. In case, unless there's something else. Oh, I do want to touch really briefly on oral history, because a lot of what I do, since it's very recent, is working with, you know, people who are working in the medical field nowadays. And the thing I really like about oral history is that it tells people that their stories matter, that someone is really interested in, you know, what they think is their day-to-day life. You know, they came here and they just got a job in medicine. But showing that their histories can have really important societal consequences, and that I hope that this research can teach us a lot more about, you know, the healthcare landscape, and also how immigrants understand and work to access their health needs.
That's great. Thank you so much, Heather, for sharing that research with us. How about you next, Terrell?
Okay, so I'm going to try to share my screen here. Let's see if I can make this work. And
yes, we can see it.
Okay, so while this is happening, I can't see the chat. So if I'm going too fast or anything, please just yell at me. So I also have to apologize. the PowerPoint is in English exclusively, but it's basically all of the text is just summaries of what I'm saying. So it should be picked up by our awesome interpreters. So I study immigration in Florida from the perspective of labor history, which is a little different than the other panelists here. Labor history is a history of workers with and without unions and their fight for workplace justice, like higher wages or healthcare, and also how those struggles move into larger political struggles and affect daily life. And specifically, I research right now the United Farm Workers in Florida. And a lot of people will be familiar with Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers in California. Most people don't know that the UFW's longest union contract was in Florida between Minute Maid and citrus workers in Central Florida. And I think that the UFW is interesting and relevant for this panel and for Florida's immigration history for a couple of reasons. The first is that the contract began in 1972 when a majority of Florida's citrus workers were African American. By the time the contract ended in the mid-1990s, 90% of Florida's farm workers were Latina. And so the union offers this vantage to watch that transition and farm worker demographics take place. And also for most of the 1970s and 80s, it was a deeply interracial union. So African American, Mexican American, Mexican, Guatemalan, and Haitian workers not only worked together in the groves, but also organized together, held meetings and social events together, and fought for each other's rights. I really am very interested in interracial labor unions, both historically and as a model for organizing today and in the future. And so I think it's really interesting to see how they did that. The union also showed, because so many of its members were immigrants, that immigrant rights really overlap with labor rights. Farm workers in Florida were typically taken advantage of because there was this looming threat that they could be deported, that their families could be separated, and that they could be taken advantage of by their employers. And so there was this vulnerability that the union was able to address by ensuring some job security, by ensuring higher wages and health care. And it's really neat looking at old photographs where you see the union hiring halls where there's like all of the healthcare benefits on the walls, because a lot of these workers weren't used to being able to just go to a doctor and be able to afford it. And so that was like, things like that are really important. And for studying the history of immigration, unions, I think, are really awesome because they're bureaucracies, and bureaucracies produce paperwork, and historians love paperwork because it's primary sources. And so you're able to look at like grievances, negotiations, meeting minutes, all of these things that give you a sense of the daily life of these workers. And so that's really cool. But as Heather was saying, oral histories are also really cool. And actually just last week, so last Thursday, I was in Florida interviewing a former member of the UFW, Tirso and Blanca Moreno. They were immigrants born in Tamaulipas, Mexico, came to Florida in the 1970s and rose to union leadership. Tirso had a work visa. Blanca, his wife, didn't. But they both became union stewards where they would negotiate with the company, where they would hold meetings. And just to make a methodological point, I think that Tirso and Blanca show that oral histories are even better if you can use archival sources with it. And so Tirso had actually been interviewed by UF's researchers at UF's Sam Proctor oral history program, but they talked to him about his later life and they didn't interview his wife. And then I found out from looking at all this paperwork that he was really central in this union, and also that his wife was equally central. And so I knew more questions to ask. And so they really, oral and archival research can really like work together and make even richer projects. One thing that I came away with, though, is that as important as the union was, it had certain limitations. So just by virtue of the fact that it was a labor organization, and so mostly dealt with wages and workplace issues, it wasn't really able to help with things that Tirso and Blanca were seeing going on with their community. And so they were able to form, so ultimately they left the union in the 1980s and attempted to address some of the shortcomings of the union by forming like a food cooperative, by having a center that taught immigrants about their rights, and also had a housing assistance program, things like that. And so I thought that was interesting, but the whole time they also insisted that, you know, the collective bargaining contract, having a union contract, having that guarantee was also really important. And so seeing like the potentials and also the shortcomings of labor unions for immigrants was something I really took away from that. And these groups also produce a lot of paperwork, which is good. And then also the other thing about my research into Florida's citrus workers is that over this period from the 1970s to the 1990s, the other big story is that Brazil took over from Florida as being the largest producer of citrus. And ultimately, a Brazilian company bought the processing plant that the Florida workers that were associated with the UFW worked at. And so what happened was Florida's and Sao Paulo, Brazil's workers were kind of pitted against each other, and in a way that drove wages down for both. And this is a pretty common story where capitalism operates globally, but workers are divided still on into local unions and aren't really aware of the fact that organizing transnationally or internationally would benefit them. And so there are some groups that do this, but I'm really interested in the ways that capital is able to keep workers separated and therefore kind of fit them in this race to the bottom, not just within communities, but between different countries. That's my slideshow. So let me see if I can stop sharing there. And I wanted to say one thing about labor unions, because I think that there's a lot of sometimes rightful skepticism among like cultural historians of immigration and also immigrants' rights groups, because a lot of labor folks get this very wrong when they talk about immigration and wages. And I just want to mention this because some groups such as the UFW in Florida did try to get this right, which is that it isn't that immigration drives wages down. It's the fact that immigrant workers are more often vulnerable and have this threat of deportation and have this threat of being separated from their families that allows their wages to be pushed down. if you address the vulnerability, then you also address the wages. And so I don't think that labor and immigrant rights are in conflict at all, but I think in fact that they can benefit one another. So I'm just going to end there.
Thank you so much, Terrell. Okay, I think that concludes the discussants portions of their formal presentations. Now we have a moment for some brief Q&A. We have about 10 minutes, so maybe have a quick answer. So we have one question, and just a reminder, you can place any questions in the Google form, and if we can't get to them in the live Q&A, I'm pretty sure that I'll be able to forward them to the discussants, and then we can get back to you at a later time with a nice answer. So there is one question for Heather, whether you what your thoughts are on thinking about Cubans in waves, especially because waves tend to be or the historiography or the literature tends to see the waves based organized along race and class lines. But based on your research especially, we can see that those distinction between the waves, it's kind of more complicated and more blurry. So do you think that the wave metaphor that a lot of historians have used is still accurate?
Thanks for that question. I definitely think it's accurate in that it presents a very easy way to get information across. It's very clear to see that we had larger moments of immigration in very specific time periods. But trying to categorize the people that are in these waves as monolithic is where we come across a lot of issues. So trying to categorize all of the golden exiles, as very now conservative, as largely more white, and the professional class, and then kind of regulating the later Marielitos into a lower social or economic class, really doesn't do us justice when trying to look at how these people were accepted into the community in real time. So that's something that I think all historians learn at one point or another, is that history is much more complicated than we give it, our original thoughts. So yeah, I think that the waves form is definitely accurate in some senses, but definitely needs to be looked at more complexly.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And another question is, Alexandra, what do you think can be done to encourage the history of U.S. imperialism in K through 12 curriculum, especially because of how much it shaped the Haitian American history that you're looking at?
Well, that's actually a very good question, because I think even right now with the policies being implemented, so we pretty much try to move away from those particular kind of studies because we see them more as controversial. Because for instance, when I got access to the archive, which was donated by George Ace Matters, I got the perspective of George Ace Matters, right? From his way of seeing an island that is Haiti, right? So obviously his perspective was already biased. So because of this, I had to do more work in the sense that I had to go and look for whole history that the Miami did, because a lot of the information are scattered, and sometimes you don't even have information. You have to even produce new information. So one thing is, I think working with Haitian scholars, those informations right now we can develop curriculum. So I think having the Haitian American Dream is a start where people who doesn't know anything about Haitian migration can pretty much go and learn about, okay, these are the key events that happen, and professors can even use it, or teachers, K-12 teachers can use it to teach their students about the different factors, different things that happen. It's also a really great question, I would say, because I was in a Facebook group, and someone was like, oh, I'm gonna do some thing with my class, and I'm gonna incorporate a lot of things that happen to immigrants in the US, but Haitian immigrants were never added to that list. So there's also this constant erasure, specifically in Florida. When we talk about migration, we tend to associate it to Cuban immigrants or Latinx immigrants in general, and we forget that one of the largest concentration of Haitian is in Florida. So we don't even see it reflected within even our institutions.
Thank you. That's a great answer as well. And I think our final answer, if we have, we have like 5 minutes for some final chats. The third question would be for Terrell. It would be, how would you encourage government policymakers to learn the history of labor unions, or what can they learn from the history of labor unions?
Especially for policymakers, I think the thing to learn is the few examples of legislation that has helped unions. And so, I mean, number one, the thing is just the right to work laws are just extremely, they make things extremely difficult for labor organizing. But the example I would point to is in the early 70s in California, the UFW got Agricultural Labor Relations Act passed that included farm workers into all of the things that the National Labor Relations Act should have included them in, but didn't. And so, and at the time in Florida, there were attempts to do that, but they were always killed in committee by representatives, usually representatives with ties to agriculture. And so I would say, maybe study the UFW's success in the 70s in California and see what they were able to do and how we can possibly make that work in a state with a very, very different political climate and a much more inhospitable political climate, probably.
That's a great answer, and it's really important that they would look at that history. So I think that concludes most of the questions. I think that I think from watching and listening to all of your research, there are a lot of common threads around Blackness, but as well also on inequality and disparities in healthcare in the US, especially for vulnerable immigrant populations, as well as the lack of language access, which I think is one of the key themes that this exposition will be touching on, especially our later panels that look particularly on how we will be expanding language access, or how we hope to expand language access in Florida, in contemporary Florida today. So I encourage anyone who's interested in that topic to also look for the details on that. And I think that concludes our panel. Thank you everybody for coming, and thank you all the discussants for coming to share their research. It's really amazing work, and I can't wait to see it in different papers and books in the future. That's really exciting. Thank you.
So much, Marianne. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne.